Hurricane Milton is barreling toward Florida. By the time many people hear this, it will already have hit. It's following another deadly hurricane that hit the southeastern U.S. about 2 weeks ago, Hurricane Helene. Yesterday, Florida's Pinellas County Emergency Management Director, Kathy Perkins, urged residents to evacuate.
We are into the final hours. So some of us may have had it in the back of our minds that it's going to turn, it's going to miss us. We're going to get hit, whether it's a direct hit or it moves slightly. There's just no ifs or buts about it. We're going to get hit, and it's going to be hard.
In the midst of all of this, there has been a wave of rumors surrounding the U.S. agency that responds to disasters, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. Maxine Joslow is a climate reporter for The Post, and she has been tracking and debunking the false claims.
All of the claims that I'm about to say are false. There's no evidence to suggest any of this is happening, but some of the false claims I've heard circulating are that FEMA is not actually responding to any of these disasters and doesn't have anyone on the ground in these states affected, that disaster victims only get $750 from FEMA to recover. That's just one bucket of money. That's false. That FEMA is diverting some of its disaster relief money to help migrants.
They stole the FEMA money just like they stole it from a bank so they could give it to their illegal immigrants that they want to have vote for them this season. You know, they're trying to get them on the voters' roll. We cannot let that happen.
Maxine says that the range of rumors is growing and includes what we just heard from former President Donald Trump, that disaster relief is being used for migrants, or what conspiracy theorist Alex Jones said on a recent InfoWars broadcast about how the government controls the weather.
They can create hurricanes, they can weaken them, strengthen them, they can kill them, they can direct them.
Again, none of this is true. But as Maxine says, the spread of these kinds of conspiracy theories can be extremely harmful, like during the response to Hurricane Helene.
This misinformation has really negative real-world consequences. For example, there was a false rumor going around that there was a dam in North Carolina that was going to collapse, and that actually led first responders and other emergency management officials to be diverted to respond to that instead of to help Helene victims. And that's just one example of how this can have real-world consequences.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Wednesday, October 9th. Today, we'll talk with Maxine about what FEMA is actually doing on the ground and how, at the same time, it's battling a wave of misinformation. So, Maxine, in this moment, as Hurricane Milton is threatening Florida, it looks extremely dangerous. This is one of those moments where FEMA plays an incredibly critical role, and has been doing so for the last couple of weeks since Hurricane Helene. But I think FEMA is one of those agencies that people think that they know what it does, but when you ask them, they don't actually know what FEMA does. Can you explain what is FEMA and how does this agency work?
Martine, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's so much misinformation and so many misconceptions about what FEMA is and what it actually does. So let's set the record straight. FEMA is the federal agency that helps lead the response to major disasters, not only hurricanes, but wildfires, floods, tornadoes, and even the COVID-19 pandemic. And their main role is to support the governors and the state emergency management officials who are on the ground responding to disasters that strike in their states. Those governors can request that the president declare a emergency disaster declaration, and that unlocks funding from FEMA. So that means that FEMA will help reimburse those states for their cleanup and recovery efforts. And then in terms of individual disaster victims, they can also apply for aid from FEMA to help rebuild their damaged property and ultimately to help rebuild their lives.
So this is an agency that's both providing some of the physical aid in the hours and days after disaster, like getting people food and water and basic necessities, but also, as you say, helping people with money, like money to rebuild, money to like get their lives together. How exactly does that work? Like, do people have to pay FEMA and the government back if they receive money in the aftermath of something like a hurricane?
In most cases, disaster victims do not have to pay back the aid that they receive from FEMA, so they can receive a $750 stipend for covering the cost of emergency supplies that they lost during disasters. That doesn't have to be paid back. They can receive up to $42,500 to help rebuild their house that was destroyed or to help pay their rent that they've fallen behind on after a disaster. That doesn't generally have to be repaid. There are some exceptions. If, for example, you have insurance that does cover something, but the insurance process takes a while, you can have FEMA cover it. And then once insurance comes through, you can, pay back FEMA.
Interesting. So what has FEMA's response been so far to Hurricane Helene and the aftermath of that?
So FEMA has deployed more than 1,500 people to respond to Helene so far. As of the latest figures that they released on Monday, FEMA said they had shipped more than 15.6 million meals, more than 13.9 million liters of water, more than 500,000 tarps, and more than 150 generators to the 6 states across the Southeast that were hit by Hurricane Helene. And in addition to that, simultaneously, they were also preparing to send personnel and supplies to Florida in anticipation of Milton's landfall.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like a lot. But at the same time, we're hearing from people in Georgia and North Carolina saying, look, I haven't seen anyone from FEMA where I live, or I've seen no evidence that they are helping out, the people in my community who need help. Where is that coming from? I mean, is it the case that FEMA is just not reaching some of these places that are pretty hard hit?
That's a great question, and my colleagues and I have tried to tease this out in our reporting. We have colleagues on the ground in many of the affected states, and what we found is that in some places it's going well, and FEMA does seem to be getting people the aid that they need. I talked to someone in Pinellas County, Florida, where Helene struck and now Milton could strike, and she told me that she had seen FEMA personnel in her community. They had dropped off food and water. But that's not necessarily the case everywhere. And we did talk to people in Western North Carolina, which was particularly hard hit by floodwaters from Helene. And several people there told our colleagues that they haven't seen FEMA there. It's been, challenging for FEMA and other first responders to reach affected communities because of roads that are totally impassable because of floodwaters. But there are some folks, particularly in Western North Carolina, who feel like the aid is just not reaching them.
So it seems like there are some legitimate concerns about FEMA, if it's getting everywhere that it needs to be, and as you say, that's a reflection of some of the logistical challenges of this agency that is facing an enormous amount of need in this moment. But also we're seeing what seems like intentional acts of misinformation, or at least rumors that don't seem to be founded in any fact. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the pieces of false information that you've seen circulating?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it is tough to ascribe intentions and to say whether people are acting with bad intentions or bad faith, but there are so many pieces of misinformation swirling out there. And perhaps the biggest one, or the most prevalent one that I've seen, is this idea, this false claim that there's no money available to respond to these disasters because it was spent already to handle the rise of migrants at the southern border. That's just not true. There's no evidence for that. Where some of the claims have gained traction, though, is when former President Trump has repeated them and other conservative influencers have repeated them on Elon Musk's X, which has really pulled back on content moderation since Musk took over the platform 2 years ago.
And it seems like that rumor is really tapping into this this feeling among a lot of conservatives that like the government is looking out for people who are, here in the U.S. illegally more than it's looking out for U.S. citizens, or that in this moment its priorities are in the wrong place.
I think it's definitely tapping into anti-immigrant sentiment and all of the sentiments bound up in that. And I also think it's related to the fact that FEMA is part of the Department of Homeland Security, which many people don't realize. And obviously DHS has become an incredibly politicized agency because it's also involved in the response at the southern border.
Mm-hmm. And to be clear, as you said, there is no evidence that is in fact the case, that any of these resources are being diverted to migrants right now.
That's correct. There's no evidence to support that claim, and officials at FEMA, at DHS, and at the White House have really tried to push back on that from spreading further.
Maxine, you also mentioned at the beginning of the show this rumor about a maximum $750 in federal assistance that storm victims can receive. And I think that number kind of jumps out to people because it's like, okay, $750, like, sure, that's nice, but if my house is destroyed, how much will that actually help me? Can you talk a little bit about where this misconception came from?
So my colleagues and I tried to trace the origins of this claim, and we did find that Vice President Kamala Harris actually mentioned the $750 in a speech that she delivered when she was visiting a really hard-hit part of Georgia.
The federal relief and assistance that we have been providing has included FEMA providing $750 for folks who need immediate needs being met, such as food, baby formula, and the like. And
then the Trump campaign and right-wing accounts seized on that clip and began circulating it without context to falsely suggest that the $750 was the only aid that disaster victims could receive, when in fact, if you watch the full clip, Harris goes on to mention that there are other forms of assistance available.
FEMA is also providing tens of thousands more dollars for folks to help them be able to deal with home repair, to be able to cover a deductible when and if they have insurance, and also hotel costs.
So how does that work in reality? Like, what is this $750? What is that referring to? How is that helping people? And what is the money beyond that is in fact available for storm victims?
So the $750 comes from what's called the Individual Assistance Program, which provides what's called serious needs assistance. Lots of jargon, lots of acronyms with this agency. But essentially what that assistance does is it covers the costs of everyday essential supplies that you may have lost if you had to evacuate your house in a disaster or your house was destroyed by floodwaters. So things like clothes, food, baby formula, breastfeeding supplies.
Like the very immediate needs.
Exactly. And the agency often quickly approves that. And so it's often the first money that disaster victims get from the federal government, but it's not the only money out there. So there's another bucket of money called financial housing assistance, and homeowners and renters can both apply for that. It can cover up to $42,500 of rebuilding your home, repairing your home, or paying up to 18 months of rent. And FEMA tends to take a little bit longer to approve that money. And of course, even $42,500 may not be enough to completely rebuild. And then there's tens of thousands of additional dollars that are available through not only FEMA, but the Small Business Administration. Many people don't realize that despite its name, SBA doesn't just help small businesses. If you're a homeowner, you can also apply for a disaster loan from SBA to help cover your costs of rebuilding. And there's a number of other programs out there. It's really not just $750.
Got it. So then there are these anti-Semitic attacks on emergency officials that we've been hearing about. We actually mentioned this a little bit at the end of Tuesday's episode of Post Reports, but I want to dive into that a little bit more here with you. Talk to me about these attacks and why they're happening.
So my colleague Will Remus on the tech team and I explored this And we found that these anti-Semitic attacks have really been on the rise on X since Elon Musk took over the platform and pulled back on content moderation and reinstated several banned accounts that had been spreading these anti-Semitic tropes. And then in the wake of Helene hitting, there have been a number of public officials, some of whom identify as Jewish or Jewish American, who have been subjected to anti-Semitic attacks online. That includes the mayor of Asheville, North Carolina, Esther Mannheimer, the FEMA Public Affairs Director, Jacqueline Rothenberg, and the Homeland Security Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, all of whom are Jewish, all of whom have come under just intense online vitriol. And these anti-Semitic attacks include some pretty wild claims that Jewish officials are even conspiring to orchestrate these disasters, to sabotage the recovery efforts, or even to seize victims' property.
And I can imagine those kinds of attacks are difficult for them personally, but how is it also having an effect on the way that they can respond to the hurricanes and to these emergencies?
I mean, obviously, it's not fun for these three officials to be subjected to these attacks, but the consequences could be much more severe for all of us. These attacks could have the effect of eroding trust in FEMA and other institutions that are offering life-saving advice during these disasters. And so Americans who believe these attacks and believe that these officials aren't acting in good faith to help us in these times of disaster might stop listening to that advice, and that ultimately makes us all less safe.
After the break, we'll hear what FEMA is doing to try to combat all this misinformation, and the fears that this agency will not be able to handle all the storms to come. We'll be right back. So in terms of how these kinds of misinformation and rumors have been affecting people on the ground who are recovering after Hurricane Helene, what have you seen? What have you heard from people?
So I've definitely spoken with sources who made clear through their stories that they shared with me that this misinformation has real life or death, in some cases, consequences for people. I'm thinking of Nicole McNeil, Asheville resident who I spoke with. And one day after Helene made landfall in Asheville, North Carolina, leading to 7 trees falling on her house and completely destroying her roof, Nicole read an article that seemed to say that a second storm was heading for the area, and she immediately had a panic attack. Her heart was racing. Her palms were sweaty. She was so anxious that she wouldn't be able to evacuate from a second disaster.
And was that an article about Hurricane Milton, or was that an article that was like completely false at that moment?
That was not about Hurricane Milton. It turned out that that article was a hoax. It was completely false. It was based on AI-generated images of a storm that didn't exist in real life.
Wow. And so what was that like for her to see this false report of this storm that was arriving imminently, even as her, house was almost destroyed? Like, what did that do for her?
Well, she had an anxiety attack immediately after reading this article. She was incredibly worried that she wouldn't be able to evacuate a second time, and that she wouldn't be able to protect her property if she stayed or if she went. And she contacted her husband, who was out of town on a camping trip, and they were having, frantic conversations about what to do about this second storm, let alone Helene. And ultimately, she realized it was a hoax and calmed down, but she told me that this really showed the fact that when you're recovering from a storm and you have limited cell service or you don't have power, you're often relying on word of mouth, and then you might have cell service for a split minute or split second and come across misinformation that really upends how you're responding in that moment.
I think that's such an important reminder too, that people who are in the aftermath of one of these storms and who are in places where there isn't consistent cell service, or they don't have access to a computer because that was destroyed in the storm. I mean that there's a limited opportunity to engage with what's happening in the news and what's happening beyond your community, and that if you're seeing something that's false, like, you might not have a lot of opportunities to read something else that corrects that.
Exactly.
So how has the federal government then been trying to combat all this misinformation?
So FEMA actually put up a dedicated web page devoted to debunking the common false rumors that have been spreading. And they've really been trying to direct people to this web page. The FEMA Director of Public Affairs has been, quote, tweeting false information and directing people to this web page. And the FEMA Administrator, Deanne Criswell, has continued to bring up this misinformation unprompted in some cases in interviews and try to correct the record.
We really have just got to stop this rhetoric, because what it's doing is it's putting fear in the people that we're not going to be there to help them. And I worry that they won't register for assistance with us and get access to the critical resources that they are eligible for. And so
FEMA officials are definitely working to combat this misinformation, but it's still really spreading and taking on a life of its own.
Yeah. Do you think it's working, those efforts to combat this misinformation?
I don't think it's working. I have seen this misinformation just continue to spread like wildfire and to gain traction. And it's a really difficult problem. And I don't know what the solution is, short of trying to direct people to accurate information as much as possible. But, part of this has to do with human psychology. We talked to a psychologist who said that in times of disaster, people are more attracted to narratives, even narratives that are patently false or wouldn't pass a simple fact check, if they help them make sense of what can be a very confusing situation. And so that helps explain why, it's really difficult to get people to stop believing these falsehoods.
And it also feels like one of those instances, and we talk about this a lot on the podcast, of the consequences of eroding trust in government institutions writ large, which we've seen in a lot of different ways. But also, I think FEMA itself, right? Like, I think so many people continue to have negative impressions of FEMA and its ability to deal with disasters or its decision making. I think it's still in part because of Hurricane Katrina and a lot of the criticisms that were made of FEMA after that, and that negative impression seems to have lingered for a long time, and it seems like it might not be getting better.
I think that's right. Hurricane Katrina was widely seen as something that harmed the reputation of the George W. Bush administration in terms of reports that they weren't prepared enough for what was ultimately a really devastating hurricane in Louisiana and New Orleans. And since then, the politics of disasters have just become incredibly polarizing and polarized. And, we're obviously in an election year, and some of this is coming from Republicans and other critics of the Biden-Harris administration who are intentionally spreading misinformation about FEMA not adequately responding to these storms to damage Harris's standing in the polls.
And then what is the future ability of FEMA to handle Hurricane Milton coming, just so shortly after Hurricane Helene, but also other natural disasters that are just becoming more frequent and more intense? Like, does this agency have the money and the bandwidth to be able to handle more disasters coming more frequently and hitting more intensely?
Yeah, obviously we know that the science is showing that climate change is making hurricanes intensify more quickly and as a result bring more destruction. And there is a real question about whether FEMA is prepared for this new era of increasingly costly and deadly disasters. I have looked into their funding extensively, and What I've found is that they do have enough funding to meet the immediate needs of Helene victims and Milton victims, and that includes the $750 payments to those disaster survivors. But if Congress does not act and approve more funding for their disaster relief fund, they could have to stop reimbursing state and local officials for the costs of other long-term recovery efforts around the country. For example, many people don't realize that FEMA is still helping to cover the costs of the cleanup efforts for the wildfires in Maui and for the bridge collapse in Baltimore, among many other past disasters that people don't realize taxpayers are still footing the bill for.
And so what would it take to fix that? Or if they need more money, like what is the process for that to happen or not happen?
So the short answer is Congress needs to do something. The long answer is the politics of this are tricky. Congress is currently on recess, and they're not supposed to come back until after the election, as many lawmakers focus on campaigning back in their districts. And as of right now, House Speaker Mike Johnson has given no indication that he's planning to call lawmakers back to Washington early to pass a disaster aid package and approve more money for FEMA. I do think the pressure on Johnson and other congressional leaders is only going to increase as the devastation of Milton becomes clear, particularly if Milton is a really devastating, really costly storm. There are going to be more lawmakers in both parties who say, we need to come back early and do something about this.
Well, we'll see if that happens. Maxine, thank you so much for explaining all this.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Maxine Joslow is a climate reporter for The Washington Post. A couple more pieces of news I'm paying attention to today. There's a new book coming out next week from longtime Washington Post legend Bob Woodward. He's now an associate editor for the Post. The book is called War, and it makes some stunning claims about Donald Trump. One of those claims? In 2020, as president, Trump secretly sent coveted coronavirus tests to Russian President Vladimir Putin for Putin's personal use. According to Woodward, Putin said to Trump, "Please don't tell anybody you sent these to me." Woodward reported that Trump's reply was, "I don't care. Fine." There are also revelations about President Joe Biden and his private, angry comments about foreign leaders. If you want to read more, we'll have a link to the takeaways in our show notes and at postreports.com. And in Las Vegas, this is the sound of the end of an era, or the start of a new one, depending on how you look at it. Very early this morning, the historic Tropicana Las Vegas Hotel and Casino imploded. It was reduced to rubble in a pretty epic way, underneath fireworks and a drone show. The Tropicana was one of the early resorts that helped shape the iconic Las Vegas skyline. But the hotel was demolished today to make way for a new stadium for the baseball team previously known as the Oakland A's. The A's officially said goodbye to Oakland last month, and the team will temporarily play their home games in West Sacramento. The plan is for the franchise to move to their new ballpark in Vegas in 2028. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. And if you want to hear more from The Washington Post, check out our opinions podcast, Impromptu. The latest episode is about just how bad the conflicts in the Middle East could get and what that means for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
His governing coalition has expanded. His approval ratings are up internally. The opposition seems completely in disarray. And, granted, the story's not over yet, but how do you think history will treat Netanyahu?
It's a fascinating conversation, and you won't want to miss it. Find and follow Impromptu wherever you listen to podcasts. Today's show was produced by Sabby Robinson, with help from Peter Bresnan and Ariel Plotnick. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Monica Campbell, with help from Rena Flores. Thanks also to Molly Hennessy-Fisk. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.